This episode of History Hunters is the last one out of the series from our trip in the fall to Humboldt County. So we have decided to stop here at Fort Humboldt, where Ulysses S. Grant spent some time. He was stationed out here. He had left his family back in the Midwest, his wife and his kids. He hated this place. It was wet, cold, it was winter time, and eventually decided he didn't want to be in the Army much longer after he was here. So this plaque was dedicated in 1980, and it reads, Fort Humboldt. By the early 1850s, newly arrived white settlers had moved into the Humboldt Bay area, causing conflict with the native inhabitants. To protect both Indians and settlers, Fort Humboldt was established in 1853 and operated until 1866. It became a focal point in the violent struggle between two cultures. Many Native Americans were assembled here before removal to reservations. This display shows Commander Charles Swain Lovell and his wife Margaret, who were here from 1860 to 1861. So they missed Grant by about 6 years. I just spotted this little display that talks about Grant being here. Turned around to find a monument dedicated to Ulysses S. Grant. He was stationed for 4 months in 1854. The young captain went on to lead the Union forces to victory in the Civil War. As the 18th U.S. president, Grant became the most renowned figure of the day and Eureka's favorite son. To recognize Grant's service at the fort, the monument plaque behind you was installed in 1925 by the Redwood Forest chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. For many years, the statue of Grant stood in the fort grounds. At one time, the only stories about Fort Humboldt were bravery and destiny on the American frontier. Today, we tell a different narrative, one of struggle, loss, and reconciliation between two peoples who continue to live side by side along Humboldt Bay. And this is Grant's statue, 1940. Apparently, it's not here anymore. Right over here is a plaque dedicated in memory of Grant in 1925. Fort Humboldt, occupied by U.S. troops from 1853 to 1865. General U.S. Grant was stationed here. Actually, he was a captain at the time. In 1853. That's actually wrong. He was here in 1854. Grant arrived at Fort Humboldt on January 5th, 1854, after sailing up the coast from San Francisco on a long and tedious voyage of 250 miles. While he found the location beautiful, he loathed its isolation. He greatly missed his wife Julia and his young sons back in Missouri. Feeling lonely and cut off from the world, he wrote Julia, "I do nothing here but sit in my room and read and occasionally take a short ride on one of the public horses." Grant complained about the infrequent letters from Julia and felt that she was indifferent to his feelings of desperation. He wrote that he was so depressed that he hadn't strayed more than 100 yards from his quarters for 2 weeks. "But you," he wrote, "never complain of being lonesome, so I infer that you are quite contented." And his dreams brought out feelings of insecurity and jealousy. He lapsed into self-pity and depression, masking his feelings of isolation with booze. While he did faithfully tend to the garden at the fort and arrange with a local hunter to provide fresh elk meat, Grant showed little interest in the only pastimes available, which were fishing and hunting. And because the local natives posed no real threat, he found the drills performed at the post to be pointless. Eureka was but a modest hamlet with a handful of sawmills and approximately 500 people. The officers' quarters and furnishings were rough-hewn from giant logs cut from nearby forests. His time at the fort was marked by illnesses and a painful toothache which required extraction. Although he turned 32 at Fort Humboldt, he said he looked in the mirror and saw a 45-year-old staring back at him. In February, he came down with chills and fevers that had to be treated by a doctor for severe attacks. So emotionally frazzled that when he lost a ring given to him by Julia at their engagement, he was beside himself until the company helped him find the ring. We're thinking this is the hospital because there's a picture of an abandoned Fort Humboldt hospital in 1900.
But there's like what are those things that they put on there's a whole,
Whole fort?
Yeah, but then you see the cow things back there.
Apparently the commissary was here. Nothing here today. While I've never believed that ghosts roam the earth, at times I refer to ghosts as memories of those who walked the ground that we walk today. I was awestruck to think that this same dirt was walked upon by Ulysses S. Grant when he was becoming a failure to booze and depression. And when I came to these stones in the ground, I had to wonder if they were foundations for building that Grant himself inhabited, or just half-buried rock. The only other reconstructed building here was the house once occupied by Assistant Surgeon Dr. Josiah Simpson and his wife Harriet Simpson, who was a gracious lady. Her letters to family give just about the only written account of life here at the fort from 1854 to 1857. Unfortunately, beautiful young Harriet died at the young age of 38 in 1862, just days after giving birth to her fourth child. She was buried in the Mount Hope Cemetery of Lambertsville, New Jersey. Her husband, Dr. Josiah Simpson, died in 1874 and was buried by her side and their children, none of which made it past the age of 8. So this little display here kind of explains how they would put boats out in the water just down the way here. And look what's here today. A McDonald's. Captain Robert Buchanan selected the fort site on a high, barren bluff overlooking the bay above Bucksport. By 1857, 14 redwood and plaster structures had been built in a U-shape around the parade ground. Due to its strategic location high on the bluff, no outer walls or palisades were built to protect the company of soldiers. Now right here were the officers' quarters, and as you can see, they were kind of in a U-shaped pattern here. I think it's really strange how they have not reconstructed any of the buildings, just 2 of them, but only mentioning where the different buildings were. Once the morning drills ended, officers often resorted to whiskey and poker to pass the time. To cope with his depression and migraines, Grant drank more, often stopping for alcohol at the nearby saloon run by James T. Ryan. Grant became careless about his dress and habits, and his drinking became problematic. On April 11, 1854, Grant was commissioned as a full captain, but shortly thereafter he was pressured to resign after he showed up drunk Sunday morning at his company's pay table. Colonel Robert Buchanan said if he didn't resign, he would face court-martial. Grant's friends were convinced that he would have been acquitted and urged him to stand trial, but he resigned. Some historians say out of fear that Julia would learn about being tried on such a charge. Grant never mentioned his drinking problem in his memoirs, suggesting the resignation was due to his desire to return home to his family. Grant was too ashamed to tell his father, Jesse Root Grant, about his resignation, but the old man found out and tried to get Army officials to reverse their decision to accept it, preferring that his son enjoy a 6-month leave instead. In retrospect, Grant's momentary disgrace can be seen as a salvation, preserving him for a starring role in the Civil War instead of stranding him at a post in the hinterland. Of course, Grant became President of the United States as well, 18th president. 2 presidents behind Lincoln. Grant boarded the steamer Arise on May 7, 1854, bound for San Francisco, where he expected to find acquaintance and business partner, Captain Thomas H. Stevens, Jr., who owed him $1,750 from an investment in a banking business. However, he found that Stevens skipped town, and Grant wouldn't see payment until 1863 as the Civil War was raging. During his short stay in San Francisco, Grant was broke and boarding in the What Cheer House. A friend took pity on him and arranged for Grant's free passage aboard a steamer to New York. Thus, on June 1, 1854, Grant boarded the passenger ship the Sierra Nevada, owned by Cornelius Vanderbilt, that was bound for Nicaragua. After crossing the isthmus to catch another steamship with more than 500 other passengers to New York, they landed almost a month later. 6 years after Grant left the fort, a tragic massacre of the Wiyot tribe took place on this Tuluwat Island in Humboldt Bay. Tensions had grown between white settlers and Indians over the seizure of cattle on tribal lands. On February 26, 1860, coordinated attacks by white settlers resulted in the murders of about 150 Wiyot people with axes, knives, and guns. The massacre was followed by similar bloody attacks on other Wiyot villages later that week. Soldiers from Fort Humboldt took many of the surviving Wiyot into protective custody at the fort, later taking them to the Klamath River Reservation. Robert Buchanan, Grant's superior who wouldn't tolerate the future president's drinking habits, died in 1878 and is buried in the Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Grant, of course, became an officer at the outbreak of the Civil War, and his military leadership helped President Lincoln save the Union by defeating the Confederates. Today, President Grant and his wife Julia are at rest in Grant's tomb in New York City. I wonder if it's coincidence that the gravesite is about as far away from Humboldt Bay as you can get without leaving the continental United States.